You're listening to Death of the Reader, Flex and Herds, here for your Murder Mystery World Tour on 2SER 107.3, where we are back with our final episode discussing The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie. Chapters 14 to 18, which is all the way to the end, so it is full spoiler territory. And Herds,
yeah, Flex.
I just want to say, I feel a modicum of sympathy for Basil Blake.
Oh, for Basil Blake, I was gonna say. I feel sympathy for several characters in this book, but yeah,
I do.
Basil's a funny one, isn't he?
It really is. Essentially, this is a very quiet stretch of chapters. We sit down, we have a few discussions about the nature of the crime, and then we just kind of get into the breakdown scene, and the explanation happens. It's really quaint.
Yeah, well, like, there is a certain amount of tension that's kind of built before the explanation scene, because we have to actually catch the killer in the act.
So dangerous.
But it's very low key, and the way that we try to kind of build that tension is through, I mean, we've talked about how there's all of these different police characters that were sort of well characterized in the beginning, but have gotten more sloppily characterized as the story is going on.
Yeah.
But we're in this situation where I think it's that Henry has been told everything by Miss Marple, and we're trying to like slip notes to the policemen so they can be around when the killer is caught. So we're kind of supposed to be in the shoes of the police while following Miss Marple. It's kind of a funny thing. And yeah, so there's this tension built as the police don't really know what road Miss Marple is leading them down. But I think by this point in the novel, you certainly have a good idea of what's going on.
I was a little confused by like how far down the garden path Miss Marple allows them to be led when there is still the risk of another murder being carried out, like very presently.
Yeah.
I don't think it ever builds a sense of tension, but it does get very close to like comedic tension, where it's like, are you kidding me? We're still going?
I think it is a genuine attempt to like build tension, but it's like, what are the chances that we're going to fail and not catch the killer before they kill Mr. Jefferson? Like, what are the chances of that actually happening? 0 to none.
With their heart attack poison.
The heart attack poison, which, is foreshadowed. To a degree, we do talk about how, it would take a very slight shock to kill Mr. Jefferson. It'd be so easy to bump him off. But we'll get into all the rules and things, I'm sure, at some point.
I did think it was interesting though that like, the foreshadowing of the way that the medicine that was used for all 3 murders is kind of hand waved by suggesting that it would have been easy to kill them in other ways as well.
It's just a convenient way of moving the story along, I guess, to get away from like, oh, but what if they struggled or whatever?
Yeah, it's almost like it's less of a murder method and more of a shorthand for a murder was done. All of the other stuff is what's important.
Well, I think that's the sort of the key takeaway, isn't it? That like it doesn't really matter. Like it matters how the murderers tried to get away with the crime. It doesn't really matter how they were actually killed. Except for that one time when Mr. Gaskell says, "I would have throttled her." Aside from that line,
terrible.
Which is, there's a lot of ridiculous lines like that though, and I do enjoy this novel, particularly in the way that Miss Marple kind of solves the murderer through like, this is something I've been looking into, that it was kind of praised at the time that it came out because of the clues are all very like feminine.
Yes.
The biggest clue is the way that the victim's nails were cut or bitten, as the case may be, like the dress, the way that you dispose of a hearthrug, things like that are traditionally looked after by the lady of the house. Those are the clues that Miss Marple alights upon.
Yeah.
And there's kind of a comedic slant to that where Miss Marple and the policeman have arrived at Basil Blake's house, right? Miss Marple to say, your husband's going to be wrongfully arrested. And then, of course, the husband comes home and then the police show up, like in this conga line of coincidences. But anyway, the policeman who's there thinks to himself, my goodness, that Miss Marple, she's so clever. She's arrived at the same conclusion we had, that this is the killer. How smart of her. Wow, her reputation really is deserved. But like, he hasn't even seen the half of it even. You might say. Anyway,
I also think that it's really fun the way that everyone gets so excited about Miss Marple solving this case, because it very much plays, I think, into the way that I understand she's characterized more broadly, where she's like not as defined of a character. She like shifts and changes kind of based on what the story needs. So this like level of enthusiasm that the police have really kind of caters to that any woman persona that she has, depending on, you know, what the story requires.
I mean, it's definitely that underdog aspect, right? Like,
Yeah.
whenever somebody hears, yes, there's this nice old lady who solves murder mysteries and she's brilliant and you should work with her, Mr. Policeman, everyone goes, that's ridiculous, but I'd kind of like to see it happen, you know? Like, nobody is quite so against Miss Marple solving the case that they like get in her way, I suppose, because I mean, that is a trope, right? The bumbling policeman who their incompetency or their prejudice or like their pride or whatever gets in the way of the actual detective solving the case. And it's not so much here as it is that the other characters kind of want her to succeed. It's just a matter of, I guess, her own skill and ability, which I think is quite pure in a sense.
Yeah, I think there's also a sense of like a bit of an inversion that happens, because we were complaining, or at least I was complaining, about how the cops get a little less distinct as we get further on into the book. At the end of the book, it feels like it plays more of a role than being lazy, because at the end, you know, we see Miss Marple's competence when she was just brought in because Miss Bantry was like, oh, well, you're good with corpses, aren't you, dear?
Yeah.
And so because of the way that she becomes more defined and the police less, we really get to see her flesh out what makes her so good as a detective, where she's like very natural at it.
Well, she takes over everything, right? Like,
Yeah.
And this is why she's so kind of undersold in the earlier parts of the story. It's so that by the end of it, she sweeps the entire situation away. She's orchestrating the police from behind the scenes to find the killer that they don't know who it is until they've literally got them in their hands, right?
Yeah, it's very difficult to say like which would be the best entry point for Marple Christie stories, because I haven't read all of them.
I was gonna say,
but this one feels like it would be very good because of that, because she comes in so like unassuming, and then we have that role inversion by the end.
Yeah, I still need to read her debut novel or perhaps some of the short stories, but this is a good entry point because she is a bit more, I would imagine, a bit more fleshed out than her initial appearance.
Yeah.
Once you've built upon the conception of a character, you can only do more interesting things with them, I suppose.
Well, I suppose until you get bored of them.
I mean, that's the case, isn't it? And I mean, the second novel was written like 10 years after the first one, so clearly there's some interest there, you know?
Either that or just a lot of reader pressure. You can never tell with these authors back when they actually used to respond to us humble listeners.
When they used to respond to our letters.
The lofty heights that they're at these days.
I'm just saying, if only there was an author who would respond to my letters, asking them why they don't include me in their murder mysteries. For some reason, I've never gotten a response. I don't know why.
For some reason. Yeah, what do you normally like send her? Do you like attach pictures of anything in particular?
Yeah, just a picture of me with my beautiful face smiling and with a bloody knife in my hand. I mean, it's strawberry jam. It's not real blood, obviously.
Yeah, well.
But being like, isn't this the face of a murderer? Don't you think that you could create a beautiful tapestry of a story around
freshly jammed toast in the background on the kitchen bench?
Toast. I do have jam toast. I prefer Vegemite, I think, for breakfast at least. But I do like a good strawberry jam toast. I imagine that Miss Marple and I, if we could have tea and jam on toast, I think we'd have a great time.
Alrighty. Well, I suppose, Herds, we should tidy up this part of the discussion and head on over and get into the mystery. Because I have a few things that I must confess I did not see coming, despite doing an overall, I think, a pretty decent job.
I think you did a pretty good job too, but we'll get into points, and maybe you should tell me these things that you're like disappointed about. I'm so curious.
Will do. All right, you're listening to Death of the Reader. We are discussing The Body in the Library by Agatha Christie all the way through to the end, full spoilers. We'll be back with more of that classic in just a second. You're on 2SER 107.3. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex here with you, and I'm joined on the line by Margaret Hickey, author of the newly released Stonetown and the newly Ned Kelly Award-nominated Cutter's End. Marg, it's so good to finally have you on the show. Welcome to Death of the Reader.
Oh, thank you, Flex. I'm so excited to be on your podcast because I'm such a fan. Thanks for having me.
It was pretty fortuitous for you having Cutter's End receive that nomination within a week of the release of its sequel, Stone Town. Has that sunk all the way in yet?
I couldn't believe it. So I was at the airport. I'm from a small country town in Victoria, and I was at Albury Airport waiting for my plane, and I was scrolling through Twitter, and someone wrote to me, congratulations on the nomination, and I just put question mark, and then I looked up on Twitter, on Instagram or something, and I saw best debut crime novel. And, it had Brian Brown, Sweet Jimmy, it had the others. And then Cutter said, I nearly died. I shouted out in line at the airport, oh, my God. and then I had to contain myself for the duration of the flight.
Yes, and didn't want airport security getting a little too concerned.
Exactly. Then I had to contain myself. And then, it's such an honour. And I'm so pleased, and to be alongside the other shortlist, I feel really privileged. So nothing like this has ever happened to me. So two things in once, the release of Stone Town and this nomination, it's just been wonderful.
Yeah, I guess one thing about Mark kind of coming into his own and growing as a character is that a strong thread between both of the novels is the fear that women, and particularly young women, face. And Mark is really interesting to me as a catalyst for that, because he's both been present for so much fear in his whole life, but at the same time is only really kind of starting to grapple with it in this part of his career that we're seeing now. Why do you think unspoken fear is such a powerful divide between even friends?
Well, I don't know so much about friends, but I think between men and women, and also between generations. And sometimes, and Flex, you're younger than me, I'm 50, and men of my friends, my very good friends who are male, my husbands, my brothers, and that sort of thing, they are only just beginning to realise, or don't realise, how frightened women can be in so many different circumstances. And when you do explain it to them, they're kind of shocked. Yeah, so I just think that it's perhaps something that we haven't spoken about much. I think the younger generations are much better at it. But that fear, and certainly with the whole Me Too, and now it's much better. But for the men of my generation, when I was young in 1989 and the early 90s, we didn't talk about those sorts of things. So now that those men of that age are getting older, like me, are in their early 50s, it's come as a slow surprise to them, which is odd. But I really do think it has.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's interesting, you mentioned the Me Too movement in there, and one of the moments that you did bring up the movement was Mark and Rachel ask a young girl what the slogan printed on the back of her T-shirt was, and then end up Googling what it was and finding out that it was a term adapted from a YA novel. I won't go into a heap of detail there, but the thing that kind of stuck out to me was that for yourself as a writer, who I know is a really big advocate of reading, both for writers and readers, that was the closest we got in the Stone Town to reading a book. So many present pop culture kind of fiction references with films and TV, but books kind of are left to these important plot moments, but very quietly in the background.
How interesting. Do you know what? I'm going to be totally honest with you. I've never actually considered that. I've only realised that now. I guess for my main character, Mark, I didn't imagine him as a big reader, or I think he's someone who has loved reading but has never really thought consciously about his own reading. Certainly pop culture is everywhere, with music and film and those sort of subculture movements like the goths, that sort of stuff. So all of that's really visible, but the reading is a more private thing, I think.
It was interesting to me because just last week on the show, we were having a discussion with Moira Redman from Clothes and Books about how Agatha Christie is kind of the same with the way that she writes fashion, where Agatha Christie rarely ever writes anything about people's clothes, but the few instances she does, it's like the most important thing in the book.
I'm thinking about the times that I have explicitly put books in and book titles in, and of course those book titles, even if they're sort of mentioned randomly, are incredibly important to what's happening at the moment or what's about to happen. So, yes, thank you for that. You've
You're welcome.
thank you for that. You've made me realize that.
Well, I suppose the other thing with like reading and books in your stories is your background comes from having a PhD in creative writing, which was studying landscapes in Australian literature. And unsurprisingly, you do a wonderful job of painting an image of this post-gold rush town where, as the press line describes it, land is the new gold. What is it about the way that the value of rural areas have changed that make it so ripe for putting these power struggles in those towns?
Oh, I mean, it's a gift. It's a joy to be able to write about landscapes as an Australian author. And I'm really fortunate because I have lived in small rural towns almost all of my life. And landscape is incredibly important to me and has always been very interesting to me. There's the really obvious things for a writer about what a rural landscape does. You can hide a body really easily and you can put people in really extreme situations like droughts or floods. You can put people in places where literally no one can hear them scream. So there's really practical components. And then there's the other components which are really important to me and which was been my research throughout my PhD and most of when I was writing in academia stuff as well, is that landscape for white Australians is so interesting because we love the landscape and we love being in rural areas so much. There's this notion of do we belong here in land that has never been seeded? So I see these characters and these people in these places every day. I'm kind of living a lot of these things that I talk about in the books. So it's really terrific for me. I feel very fortunate.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned in there that I thought was really interesting is the idea of, particularly you said you can't hear people scream, this idea of like deep space and the barking owl and the kind of the old school country tale that barking owls have this sound like a woman screaming, blood curdling in the night.
When I'd first moved from one country town to another and I'd moved to the Warby Ranges, so this is like 2017, this is northeast Victoria. We woke up and it was about June or July and there was this most horrific scream. And my husband and I both woke up, this sort of sobbing, wailing scream. And it is the most terrifying thing I've ever heard of. My husband went outside. He was calling out, worried that there was a woman there being attacked. We went to call the police and then we said, no, this can't be right. Like, we're in the middle of nowhere. This can't be right. But we didn't sleep the rest of the night. And,
understandable.
and then we would hear it, not very often because they're endangered. It never got any easier. But, I've been walking in the bush near my house and I've looked around and there's a man with binoculars looking. And my first instance is he's spying on me or he's going to murder me. And then he's looking for birds, Ninus conivens, maybe the barking owl.
That was one thing that I thought was so fascinating about this motif through the stories, because you bring in the bird watching club, which obviously harkens back to that particular moment you're talking of there. And I loved it in relation to that kind of deep space, no one can hear you scream metaphor, where these bird watchers are out there, at least in relation to the crime, hunting for something that might not even exist. Like, it may not have been a barking owl that screamed in the crime.
Yes.
And it's such like a horror novel thing to do, this group of people there looking for the non-existent.
You're so right. And you're saying that is everything that I hope people would think too, because I think that too. It is disconcerting to see someone standing so still in the middle of the bush, in Chiltern National Park where no one ever is. And this feeling of who's watching who and what are you actually doing here? But of course, they're looking for birds. So it was a good thing to put in the book. Yes.
Well, fantastic, Margaret. It's so good to have finally had you on Death of the Reader. And I've had such a fun time reading through both Cutter's End and Stonetown. I really hope that people enjoy them as much as I have.
Thank you, Flex. Your support to new Australian writers and writers who have been around for a long time is really valued. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. You're listening to Death of the Reader. We are discussing Agatha Christie's The Body in the Library, which we'll be back with more in just a second. If you want to get a copy of Stonetown or Cutter's End, we'll have links up on the podcast. And thank you to Penguin here in Australia for providing us with some copies. You're on to SCR 107.3. Stick around. You're listening to Death of the Reader. Flex and Herds here for Agatha Christie's The Body in the Library on your Murder Mystery World Tour. We're discussing all the way to the end. I have been in the hot seat, and Herds, I finally did it. I have tried and tried and tried so many times to pose a correct theory in the first week of the various books we've covered this year, and I've gotten close on several occasions, but only this book have I finally managed, I hope, to get ahead of it all in the first week.
I mean, look, let's talk about the points breakdown here and how we're gonna do this, because I'll be honest, I'm torn. This is definitely one of those stories, because you did such a magnificent job of solving
thank you.
the core mystery and the connected web. You even nailed down the murderers, and their relationship. You didn't pick out that they were married, I think, which was interesting.
No, I didn't. There were a lot of details that I slipped through that we can get into in a bit, but I want to hear this verdict first.
Yeah, because we talked last week about, what is the biggest clue that Miss Marple is going to use to identify the corpse and to kind of prove everything. And the answer was, of course, the fingernails, because the difference between the two bodies is that Ruby Keene, the victim that we're looking for, would have, if she had cut her nails short, would have done a very neat job of it. But it is pointed out a couple of times in the novel that they look bitten. There is a secondary clue about how her teeth are said to stick out when they actually stuck in, but I don't care about that one. The answer I was looking for was she bit her nails. Because the body was, in fact, that of a schoolgirl who did bite her nails. I'm kind of torn because I think you did such an excellent job of picking out that individual clue, but you did stumble at the finish line. You did not say that she bit her nails.
No, I it was definitely a piece that clued me into why they were different bodies and actually lining up the details of the crime, but it's just that the specifics of it being a schoolgirl would obviously bite her nails is just so reductive.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to be very clear, it is not just that a schoolgirl would bite her nails. It's that a nightclub dancer probably wouldn't.
Yes.
Because it is directly said in the text that the corpse had bitten her nails.
But it's it's established that she's a young and new nightclub dancer. She's not that much older, and it's also she's potentially just been told huge life-changing information, and maybe she was nervous.
Maybe look,
so I don't know. I didn't feel like I can understand it being the clue that Christie used, but I also don't think there was any way that I would have gotten that.
Look, here's the thing: you're not Miss Marple. You're not a lady detective. You're not.
That's true.
Lacking in certain areas. I'm just saying, but I think that all that is said and done with the fact that you solved it in the first week, and I was incredibly impressed with the detail you managed to extract, and you did pick the nails out specifically. I am going to give you your full points. I am going to give you 4 points for this novel. I think that to hold back any points would be cruel and unusual.
I was a little worried that you were going to pin me on the fact that I said that Basil Blake was meant to be framed by them putting the body in the Banshees library rather than that Basil moved it himself.
I think that that's a fine detail to kind of miss, because the real explanation is, he was drunk, so he did a stupid thing, which is fine. It's an explanation, but it doesn't completely work.
I know.
It doesn't feel entirely satisfying, I feel.
I do like it, the way that it works, though, in terms of that scene we were discussing in part 1 of him being embarrassed.
Yeah.
The idea that he's also too proud to go to the police when he's oh crap, there's a body in my house.
There's a dead body in my house. I won't report it. I'll take it somewhere else. Oh, those banshees are stuck up.
I did really love how, I mentioned in the first part of this episode, how down to the wire it was that they actually let the murder attempt go, and it's straight up the needle's nearly in his arm when the policeman grabs it out of her hands, and it's just
it's so close. It's to build tension when you're but if the needle went in, what kind of murder mystery novel would this be? To just let him die.
It's so weird seeing a scene that feels so much like it was written for television, before television was like a huge entertainment medium. It's crazy.
Well, I don't know about you. Can I say I was viewing the silhouettes in my mind, like the way I'm imagining this scene shot is it's like we're looking at from sideways from the side of the bed. We're looking forwards, and we see like the silhouette of Jefferson in the bed lying down. We kind of see the outline of his nose. It's like in profile. And then we see the window open behind the bed, the curtains fluttering. Thank you. And the candle blows out or whatever. And then the figure creeps from like the end of the bed, the end where the toes are, all the way up to where the head is. And we're like, we can't tell who they are because it's a murder. We gotta hold the mystery off until the second when they bring up the needle up into the air. And then an arm comes out from like behind the curtains or out of a wardrobe.
I was like thinking exactly the same way as I was reading that scene. That's so fascinating to me that we kind of pictured it so distinctly the same way. It gets back to exactly what I was saying, right?
Yeah, it ties into these tropes of like the catching of the villain at the last moments.
I think the other thing that was fun about this mystery in terms of its like fair play nature was that the pieces that you had to solve were so obviously presented to you. In this novel, I feel like I really had to get to understand the characters a bit more to appreciate the puzzle, which was like a pretty engaging way to integrate persona into a mystery novel.
Well, I mean, this novel has sort of a interesting trajectory where we get to the halfway point in the novel, and the cops are saying, well, clearly, after all of this digging we've done, after all of this police work we've been observing, it's a question of alibi. I think that the big clue that I don't know if we've even like talked about properly so far is that the schoolgirl goes missing during the day, and everyone assumes, oh, she's been killed because she saw something.
Yeah.
But if she's been killed because she saw the murder of Ruby Keene, she would have been disappeared during the night when we think that it happened.
Yes.
You switch around the times, then you can bypass the alibi completely and look at the murder in a completely different light.
I think to sum up, I have really enjoyed this book, but it definitely is a bit of a coffee table mystery, you know?
Sure.
It didn't blow my mind. I enjoyed it a lot. And I will look back fondly on it, but it's also kind of like I guess the question I'm asking myself right now is where does this go in our ranking at the end of the year? Because it's so easy to recommend because of how comfortable and accessible and fun it is, but it's also not the most exciting novel.
Yeah.
It's not the one that changed the way I think about things.
No, it definitely didn't like blow my mind or change my perspective or anything.
Yeah.
But I will say I liked Miss Marple as a character a lot more than I thought I would. I thought she'd be a bit boring or like not that exciting to follow.
Yeah, like when you describe Miss Marple, you're like, yes, the lady detective, what a trope. But her actual execution is so good.
Yeah, I think she's really entertaining to follow. And as I've said every week now, like those little moments in the narration where her eyes flicker or she turns in her chair very slightly and you go, oh, this is the clue. This is the crack the case moment. This is it. She's done it. Like the fact that such a small
it's
ripple.
It's so user-friendly.
It's great. Like such a small ripple in her manner can indicate that she has stumbled upon the linchpin of the case. Somerset House, right? It's beautiful. So I guess you need to tell me what we're doing now, Flex. What book have you got in the cooker for next time on?
Next week on the show, Herds, we've got a little bit of a twist. No points on the line for this one. I'll have another book to prepare for you shortly thereafter. But I thought it'd be good fun to take a look at some of the adaptations of The Body in the Library, which we were discussing doing last week on the show.
Yeah, no, I am excited for that, actually. I've been having a look through. There's quite a few adaptations. There's like a Korean adaptation. There's a French adaptation. It looks great. Look,
yeah,
let's get into this. Let's get into that nonsense.
I don't think I want to prescribe any particular ones, though.
I mean, I'm interested in Miss Ma Nemesis, but I do want to like give these a look over and figure out which are quality before we dive into them, as it were.
For sure, but don't feel worried about watching exactly the adaptations that we have. Bring an adaptation of your own next week on the show. Let us know about it. And we would love to sit and discuss just the general way that this story has been revered by the broader media.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I always like doing something a bit weird on the show, so this should be good. Yeah.
You're listening to Death of the Reader. We'll be back with that next week here on your Murder Mystery World Tour. You're listening to 2SER 107.3.